But for now, you know, did you actually see what was going on? In short, I'll summarise, the left essentially got quite a kicking. I would say that actually the centre seemed to hold on quite well, but it was the right side of the spectrum, basically, that got quite major gains. Of course, you've seen Macron over in France. He's responded by calling another election off the back of that. I'm joined now by pollster and Professor of Politics, Matt Goodwin. Good evening to you, Matt. I've just summarised in a brief nutshell some of the goings-on. I can tell you there's warnings galore from many prominent politicians today, telling us all to be careful of the far right, the hard right, and so on and so forth. Help our viewers understand what happened and the impacts here of that too.
Yeah, well, great to be with you, Michelle. So we've had elections to the European Parliament, elections held across the European Union, and what we've seen really is the best result for what I would call national populist parties in the entire history of the European Union. Now, what do we mean by national populists? Well, we're talking about parties that, unlike the mainstream parties often, they prioritise the interests and the culture of the majority group against what they argue are a corrupt, neglectful, insular elite, which is no longer interested in the ordinary man and woman on the street. That's what they argue. Now, what's so significant about these elections, Michelle, is that you've seen people like Marine Le Pen in France, Alternative for Germany, the Austrian Freedom Party, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, top the polls at these elections. And that's going to pile pressure on the European Union, not just to slash immigration and strengthen the borders, but also send more of those powers down to the nation states rather than keep hoarding power at the centre. So my last point here is we've been told ever since Brexit that Britain is the country that is struggling with populism and is struggling with chaos. Well, actually, Michelle, looks like the European Union is too.
And should we be terrified about this? Because that's what some people are suggesting today. Apparently, it's a huge warning bell going off that we all need to heed.
Some of these parties aren't particularly nice, and some of the people in these parties, as we've seen in the case of Germany, where one of the politicians there had seemingly made nice noises about people in the SS in the Second World War. Some of these politicians aren't nice, there's no doubt about that. But my view is that actually this debate is also infused with a lot of what I'd call liberal catastrophizing, namely that when parties do well, that want things that liberals don't really want to give people, like lower migration, stronger borders, they use concepts like the far right, Islamophobia, transphobia, or the new one, which is just simply hate. They use these concepts to try and shut down debate and discussion over issues that are entirely legitimate to talk about. And I think, to be frank, many voters now, Michelle, can sense that. They can sense that the national conversation is being constrained. There's no doubt some of these parties are bad news, no doubt about that, but many others operate within democracy. They just want a different kind of democracy, Michelle. They want to put the majority will ahead of minority elites. And that's a direct conception of democracy. It's not a liberal conception of democracy, but it is democracy nonetheless.
Interesting stuff. That's Matt Goodwin there, the Professor of Politics. Thank you for your time. George, are you terrified by this so-called surge in the so-called far right and hard right? I'm laughing, by the way, and I'm laughing just because I just think it's people just banding this term around all the time, and I think it's pretty ludicrous. But anyway,
I actually think Matt's made a very good point, which is that term far right's often bandied about too liberally, because these parties, some of them are different. Some of the people within them have some quite unpleasant views and have expressed those. But you have to separate that out from the people that voted for them. And the truth is, what most people realised is that these were European elections. They regard the European Parliament as a bit of a joke, as we used to when we were in the EU. And they're using this as an opportunity to register a protest vote. And it's a protest against a cosy consensus within the establishment. It's a rejection of sort of EU control and the undermining of national democracy. And it's also, undoubtedly as well, partly driven by concerns about immigration. And we're not the only country in the world that's experiencing a lot of asylum seekers and so on. Other countries in Europe are too. So I think you've got this combination of things that have driven people to register a protest vote in an election that they don't think matters. So we shouldn't read too much into to it, but we also shouldn't ignore it. And that's where I think Emmanuel Macron, it's a surprising decision to go and have an election. He would have been better to let things calm down, because then he probably would have found national politics would return to normal. But to do it when they've got a spring in their step and momentum is a rather peculiar judgment, in my view.
Yeah, I've got to say as well, so Marine Le Pen's party basically got double of what Macron got. That's why he has perhaps panicked in the way that he has. Let me just show you, before I bring Zoe in, some of the responses that people have been busily tweeting out about these outcomes here in the UK. So let's have a look. So Dawn Butler, for example, she has some harsh words to say on that. So this is Diane Abbott. This is the far-right surge in European countries. It's clear that some would like to replicate that here in Britain. That one there was Diane Abbott. Next one. Let's have a look at what Jeremy Corbyn has to say. The far right is rising across Europe because politicians on both sides have pandered to their rhetoric and normalised their idea. The only answer to hatred is hope. We've got to stand up to racism, defend refugees and inspire people to believe that a kinder world is possible. Dawn Butler, I could tell you, she tweeted out, "We were all warned about the rise of the far right and incels," in massive capital letters, that bit. The attack on work feeds into this dangerous rhetoric. The surge in support for the far right across Europe is a warning for us all. Farage and Reform. Some Tories should be nowhere near power. What do you think to some of that, Zoe?
Well, I think George made a good point about the specific context around these elections and how with the European election, people, were, in many cases, were registering a protest vote, and Macron kind of making the political calculation to go early to the French population in the hope that actually, when it comes to people voting for the government in France, they will consider their vote more and perhaps won't lodge a protest vote. Will think kind of more, think more carefully about what they actually want to see in France. I think it's also possible to kind of overstate some of these gains. Actually, the Identity and Democracy Party, I mean, if you look at the composition, it's barely larger than the Greens within the European Parliament. It's well under half the size of the centre-left. And it's about a third of the size of the centre-right group. So you were right, Michelle, actually, the centre really does hold on, and that's where the vast majority of the votes are. But, as a progressive, I do find it quite alarming. We've heard coming out of Europe, lots of people kind of warning about the rise of the far right, particularly amongst young voters, which is quite interesting, because we know here in the UK there tends to be more support for right-wing parties from older groups. But in Europe, we're seeing quite a bit of support from younger groups, and that has been linked somewhat to social media and the kind of spread, in some cases, of conspiracy theories as well. So stuff like that, I think we have to be really careful about. Misinformation spreading, political parties jumping on misinformation to shore up support and sow division. But I would also say, clearly if people across Europe are unhappy with the state of play in some cases, politicians need to listen to them. We can only move forward with productive conversations about things. And I also think, there is an argument here that in the face of financial insecurity and growing inequality, people are clearly unhappy and government should respond to that.
I'll just bring up, actually, the composite now of the European Parliament, what it will look like, just in case you're not familiar with it. In essence, though, like we've just been describing then, the parties to the right of the centre. So if you imagine, if you can see where Renew Europe is, and then you've got the EPP, I would draw the dotted line there, where I would say the kind of the centre is, and then to the right of that, starting with the EPP onwards, that is where I would describe as the centre-right, leaning more towards the right. As we've just been discussing, they do tend to group together.